Let me introduce Dr. Trueman. I've been following his work for a while, so deeply appreciative. And in particular, I think a work that, and even he would say, has really helped give him some more public profile is his couple of recent books he's put out, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, as well as kind of a shortened version of it. You think, okay, that book's about this page. I like the thinner book. A new, shorter version of that called Strange New World. And we have both those for sale tonight, but it is really asking fundamental questions about identity and sexuality and how in the world did we get here, and what as Christians, how do we think about this, how do we respond, that sort of thing. And so we are so appreciative of having him here. Dr. Trueman is he's done research at Princeton, taught seminars at Princeton, was at Westminster Theological Seminary. He is currently at Grove City College in Pennsylvania, where he is the professor of biblical and religious studies. He's also a fellow of Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. We are honored, deeply honored to have Dr. Carl Trueman with us tonight. Would you all put your hands together and welcome him to the stage?
Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you all this evening. When I realized I was competing not just against Valentine's Day, but also against, I think, a tent revival down the road at the university, I wasn't sure if anybody would actually bother turning up. So it's very gratifying and to see you here, and thank you very much for coming, and thanks for the very kind words of welcome. I want to speak this evening on the issue of sexual identity, but it's going to take me quite a while to get there, because what I want to do is really, I think, flesh out what I consider to be one of the major blanks or the major lacks in the book or the books that I've written on this subject. Certainly the big book, when I wrote it, was as much myself thinking out loud as anything. It was a book that I wrote because I was interested in hashing out the ideas and the issues for myself. And since writing the book and having it published and speaking on it and engaging with various people around the country on it, I've come to think, I think, more deeply and more broadly about the kind of issues that it raised. And that's what I want to explore this evening. We're all aware, I think, of the questions that swirl around the issue of identity in our contemporary culture. We're all aware, I think, of the confusion that has been exhibited by senior public figures, both here in the United States and, perhaps you're not so aware, but back in the United Kingdom, relative to the question of what does it mean to be a woman? How does one define woman? Round about the same time that now Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson was struggling with that question in D.C., the Labour Shadow Minister for Women and Minorities was struggling with that question back in the United Kingdom. And it struck me as rather odd that she would be the Shadow Minister for Women and not be able to define exactly who or what she was representing. And yet, that doesn't strike us as unusual today. I think we're all challenged too by the rise of artificial intelligence. I wrote this lecture, or much of this lecture, about 3 weeks ago. As is always the risk these days when you write lectures on these topics, they can be out of date within 24 hours. There is a sense in which this lecture is already out of date because ChatGPT hit the headlines around about 2.5, 3 weeks ago. And I'm assuming what is true for me is also true for the Asbury and the University of Kentucky professors in the audience. Probably you have found yourself or will find yourself very shortly summoned to a seminar to talk about the impact of ChatGPT on your teaching, your classes, your grading. Something that I think 4 weeks ago nobody would have anticipated arriving so soon. And when you think about the rise of social media as the primary way of forming relationships today, I want to suggest that all of these things point to the fact that behind questions about sexual identity, behind questions about gender, behind questions posed by artificial intelligence, behind questions raised by social media and virtual friendships, lies the deep question, not so much what is a woman or what is a man, but what is a human? What does it mean to be human? And what I want to do this evening is set the question of sexual identity within the context of a much broader discussion of what it means to be human. And I want to do this along a relatively narrow front. To explain that narrow front, I want to start by making a distinction. I want to make a distinction that I think marks human beings off from every other creature on the face of the planet, at least every other creature of which I'm aware. I live in Western Pennsylvania. I'm aware of a lot of creatures, actually. When you live in the middle of nowhere, Upper Appalachia, I am very fond of the great wildlife that lives in my neighborhood. We have a local bear who I've never seen. My neighbor saw him wandering through my garden at 1:30 in the morning. I'm not sure whether I should be more disturbed by the bear or by the fact I have a neighbor who's apparently watching my garden at 1:30 in the morning. We have coyotes. Again, I haven't heard the coyotes, but I hear them barking and scratching at my wall outside my bedroom early in the morning. And we have a fox that I have seen. I grew up in a part of the UK where foxes were common. I've seen what a fox can do to a chicken or do to a duck. And I would say, if you've seen one fox in the presence of a chicken or a duck, you've seen every fox in the presence of a chicken or a duck. Why do I say that? Foxes are creatures of instinct. I might put it another way, and here I come to the distinction I want to make. What a fox is and who a fox is, it's a meaningless distinction. A fox is what a fox is. Who a fox is what a fox is. What I mean by that is an animal of instinct. He's not an animal of intention. He's an animal of instinct. Human beings, there is a distinction between what we are and who we are. If I were to chat to some of you afterwards and ask you, tell me about yourself, you're not going to tell me your blood group. You're not going to tell me your genome. You're going to tell me about the various decisions you have made over time that have shaped who you are. I know what you are. You're human beings. That tells me almost nothing of importance about you, because human beings are creatures of intention. We do things not so much instinctively, but because we will to do them. Beavers build dams. Human beings build bridges. Foxes will make themselves a set. We design and build houses. If you've seen one fox in the presence of a chicken, you've seen every fox in the presence of a chicken. That does not apply to human beings. Every human being may have a different reaction to a chicken. One may love and care for it, another may break its neck and cook it and eat it. We choose, we freely choose how we relate. So I want to suggest that we need to hold in mind there's a distinction between what we are as human beings and who we are as human beings. And the interesting thing about human beings is it's the who question, which is where we really ground our identity, by and large. It's not what I am. I don't think of myself as a member of a species so much as I think of myself as an individual. And what I want to suggest this evening is that much of the problem we face today relative to identity is this. We are now at a stage in social, cultural development, human development, where we are able to put tremendous distance between the who we are and the what we are. We are reaching the point where we at least imagine ourselves to be free from the constraints of the what in constructing the who. How do we do that? Well, I want to go back a couple of hundred years. Many of you will be familiar, I'm sure, with the legend, the story of Dr. Faustus, the man who sells his soul to the devil in exchange for certain experiences in life. The most famous one, version of the story, I think, in the English-speaking world is that by Christopher Marlowe, the contemporary of William Shakespeare. The most brilliant philosophical articulation of the Faust story is that by Goethe, the great 18th, early 19th century German polymath who wrote the great two-part poetic drama, Faust. Right at the beginning, near the beginning of part one of Faust, you have this encounter between the good doctor, Dr. Faust, and Mephistopheles, the Satan figure, the devil figure. And Mephistopheles is there to tempt Faust. And he tempts him in a very significant way. He says this, in response to something Faust says, he says, "My dear sir, you are looking at things in a conventional way. We must do better than that, or the joys of life will escape us. Hang it! You have your hands and feet. You have a headpiece and a codpiece. And anything else you can enjoy is yours, isn't it?" And then he makes this very, very significant statement. If I can afford a coach and six, isn't their energy mine? I can ride around proudly as if I had 24 legs. Notice what he's saying there. If I had a coach and six, then their power is my power. I am, we might say, technologically transformed. That which I am changes as I harness the energy of the coach and six. What Mephistopheles is doing here is presenting Faust with a technological temptation. He's presenting Faust with the temptation of technology that I think has two sides to it in the Faust story that play out dramatically in contemporary culture today. The first is to see the world as raw material for our wills. What is the world there for? It's there to provide raw material for us to be able to do with what we will. Secondly, Faust is being tempted to see himself, and we by technology are tempted to do the same, as something to be transcended, something to be overcome. We might say that the technological temptation, to use the distinction that I was playing with a few moments ago, the technological temptation is the temptation to detach the who question almost entirely from the what question. Now, the intuition that we are free, sovereign individuals runs very deep. The intuition today that we can invent ourselves runs very deep. What I do in the two books that were recommended to you earlier on is I really trace what I would sort of an intellectual story of that. I look at figures like Rousseau and Karl Marx and company. What's interesting about those figures, of course, is that virtually nobody reads them. The people today who find the question of what is a woman complicated, by and large, have not read those people. One of the most disturbing things, I think, about the agendas, the identity agendas being pushed by politicians and those in power is almost none of the politicians have read the relevant literature that would allow them to opine with any authority on these subjects. They have intuitions. And the question then comes, where do the intuitions come from? Why is it that we live in a world where the belief that we are free and sovereign and can basically control our own identities, shape them in any way we wish, where does that come from in a world where people aren't getting up every morning and reading Nietzsche or cyborg feminism? Well, what I want to do this evening is look at some elements, some of which you may not even notice before, that shape our thinking in that direction. And I'm going to start with one. Last week I was giving a version of this lecture to a group at a college where a number of protesters had turned up, expecting me to say something very offensive. So I said, okay, I know some of you are here to protest. Let me get the most offensive and controversial topic out of the way first. Music. They did not expect me to say music. Think about music. Where does music come from? Well, every culture of which I'm aware has music. Music, by and large, as far as I understand it, has typically had a communal significance. Key events in the life of a community were marked by music. Celebrations would be marked by music. Death and bereavement would be marked by music. Lamentations, funeral dirges, funeral music. Parties would be marked by music. Communal experiences, experience of people as a people, were often marked by music. Think of the African American spiritual tradition, the suffering of a particular people articulated powerfully through the idiom of music. Think of the Psalms of the Old Testament. Think of the rich traditions of ballads and folk songs many cultures have. I know Appalachia has a great tradition of folk music. The dulcimer, I think, is an Appalachian instrument, I believe. My son plays it, I don't. I'm learning the 5-string banjo, which I think that's a Kentucky instrument, I think. So there you go. One of few Englishmen to have picked up the banjo. Notice, I took the banjo. I was telling somebody, I said, why do you do the banjo? And I said, well, I decided a few years ago I want to learn a musical instrument. And because I'm a wise man, I always ask my wife's advice on any important life decisions. Which instrument should I learn? So I said I'd give her two choices, bagpipes or banjo. I think she meditated and prayed and fasted for about a nanosecond and then said, please make it the banjo. Please make it the banjo. So I'm learning the banjo. What I'm saying here, though, of course, is that music arose out of and reflected. It was a constitutive part of communal life. Music was something that brought everybody together and reminded them, in fact, made them, we might say at key points, part of the community. Secondly, notice it always had to be live. 200 years ago, 150 years ago, to enjoy music, you either had to be part of a group producing it, or you had to go somewhere where somebody else was producing it. Music was a matter of communal production. It served a communal function, and it was communally produced. The very experience of music drew you into, bound you to, the community. Now, I don't know about you, but music is a big part of my life today. Much of my waking hours are spent with music in some shape or form, typically in the background. What's interesting is my primary experience of music is as an individual, running on the treadmill with my earbuds, listening to it while I'm doing grunt paperwork at work or something like that. It's individual. It's not a communal production anymore. It's something that, if you like, has completely changed its function. Music that was a communal production was there to make the community a community, to embody the community. Music that is a matter of individual consumption does exactly the opposite thing. It makes me think I'm an individual. And the better, or the more impressive the technology, the more sovereign I feel. I'm a bit of an old prog rock guy in some ways. Spotify. There will never be another Pink Floyd. Some of you are thinking, well, who on earth is Pink Floyd? Pink Floyd, the strength of Pink Floyd was their concept albums. You didn't just listen to a track from Pink Floyd, you committed yourself to 90 minutes of listening to the whole album in the order in which the band had put it together. Now I choose. I have my own playlists. I choose the stuff I like. I am sovereign over it. Think about how that shapes the way I think about myself. I think about myself as an individual. The very thing the communities had to express communal identity is that which reinforces my sense of myself as a free, sovereign individual. I haven't got time to do it this evening, but at Grove I do a similar thing with dancing. Think about dancing. if you've ever watched, it shows how much I love my wife. I will watch Jane Austen dramatizations with her. You know, nobody dies. There's got to be a tragic death for it to be worth watching. You know, it's one of those, I was introduced to Jane Austen at all-boys school, age 15. That killed Jane Austen for me. You know, one of the long book, nothing happens. But they occasionally have a dance scene. Think about the dance scenes in Jane Austen. No individual makes sense in a Jane Austen dance scene unless they're understood in terms of the other individuals. Mr. Darcy can only impress on the dance floor if he absolutely coordinates himself with everybody else. Think about John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever. John Travolta is the individual, strutting his own stuff, expressing himself. Think about how dancing functions now at typical weddings. It is not about communal identity. It's about individual expression. The idea that I am really who I think I am or whoever I want to be, and that my authenticity is found in my outward expression of that, can be seen in the practice of contemporary dance. My wife makes me dance, but I hate it. And I say to her, dancing today, it's a mating ritual. Once you've found a mate, you don't need to dance anymore. I've been married nearly 33 years. I don't need to dance anymore. My wife is philosophically Philistine. She doesn't get the point particularly. So anyway, there's the first thing. Now let's think about the vision of humanity and human identity that undergirds medical ethics. Think about the medical field. I would say medicine increasingly encourages us to think about our bodily limitations as things that are problematic and to be overcome. Plastic surgery is a great example of this. Now we have plastic surgery going way back to the ancient world. Reading about it, it's pretty horrific. They had nose jobs in the ancient world. It must have been a very painful, somewhat risky experience. They had primitive skin grafts. But plastic surgery really takes off after the First World War, when you have men coming back from the trenches whose physical appearance has been destroyed by what they've experienced in the trenches. And plastic surgery really takes off as an attempt to give some bit of dignity back to these men whose bodies have been so badly ravaged by what they experienced. It was restorative. It was not an attempt to transform them into something that they weren't or never had been. It was an attempt to restore something of what had been or what should have been there to them. Plastic surgery now. I don't know what precise statistics on this, but my bet is that most plastic surgery in the United States is not restorative. It is transformative. It is predicated on the idea, well, my body isn't quite good enough. And with a nip and tuck here and a bit added on there and a bit taken away there and something else injected here, I can transcend my natural body and become something which I am not. And that's just one simple slice of the medical field. Think of gene editing. I find it rather annoying when Iceland boasts that it's eradicated Down syndrome. It has not eradicated Down syndrome, of course. It has eradicated people with Down syndrome. And there's a very important distinction there. Think about surgery that is increasingly geared to psychological therapy. I'm uncomfortable with this or that part of my body. In all of this, I think we see the realities of nature subjugated to the ambitions of the will and of desire. Think about sex. Now, much could be said in this area. I'm going to make a number of comments. It's not cumulative. I want to make a number of discrete observations in some way on this point. First of all, I think there is the move to seeing sex primarily as recreation. Think about that. Seeing sex primarily as recreation, which I think is the presupposition of coming to see sex as identity. That is only possible. Sex as recreation is only possible in a technological world. Just as background, I would say changes in attitudes and understanding of sex are very important. They're not the equivalent of, when we debate sexual mores, we are not debating rates of income tax, which may make some difference to society, but very marginal ones. When you start to change your understanding of the function of sex, you're debating something about what it means to be human at a very deep level. There is a reason why cultures typically surround sex with sacred rituals, why they typically regard it as something very serious, if not sacred. It is the thing, of course, that leads to the creation of new life. It was inevitable, I think, that it would be treated with great deference and great sacredness by societies. But that is not our society. We now think of sex primarily as recreation. Well, for sex to be thought of as recreation, it has to be cheap and safe. What do I mean by that? It has to carry with it minimal risk and involve minimal effort. Thought experiment. Imagine you're a young guy, you're 18, 19-year-old guy, your hormones are on full alert, full blast in 1850. Most of your day is spent thinking about, can I find a woman in this life to have sexual relations with? What have you got to do in 1850? What have you got to do in 1850? You've got to work hard. You've got to be clean. You've got to have a job. You've probably got to impress her parents and her brothers and sisters, and you've got to impress her. Because if you have sex with her and she gets pregnant, there are all kinds of consequences that will follow for both of you from that. Sex becomes costly. Sex is really very, very hard to separate from long-term effort and long-term commitment. That's how you think about it. Once you live in a world with easy access to antibiotics and easy access to contraception and abortion, sex becomes cheaper. It carries with it less of a risk. I remember a few months ago, my wife and I were walking through a town. We were on our way to see our son, and we broke journey in central PA for a night, and we found ourselves walking back from the restaurant. Suddenly, we're in the middle of this small but very loud pro-abortion protest. And I was struck by one of the signs that I witnessed there. One of the signs said this: consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy. It struck me as a very interesting sign that makes sense today, but only makes sense today because of the technological world we live in. Now, it's true that consent to sex for a guy did not lead to the guy getting pregnant in 1850. But he did live in a world where it meant there were obligations that would almost certainly seek him out afterwards. You can only say consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy in a technological world. A technological world that has transformed the meaning of sex and therefore transformed the meaning of what it means to be human and how sex can function in terms of our identity. That leads me then to the second point about sex, and that's sex as identity. Sex as identity, I think, it has an intellectual genealogy. And the intellectual genealogy is inseparable from the life and thought of Sigmund Freud. Most of Freud's ideas, positive ideas, the Oedipus complex, etc., have been roundly discredited and rejected. But sometimes ideas that are wrong still gain a lot of traction. Sometimes ideas that are wrong are believed because the context in which we live and the tilt of the human heart and the human makeup allow such ideas to become strong ways of thinking. Freud is the man more than any other who provides the conceptual framework that allows us to think about sex as identity. When Freud, in his 3 essays on sexuality, lays out a taxonomy of what it means to grow up, from infancy to old age in terms of the direction and nature of sexual desire, what Freud does there is he places sexual desire right at the center of what it means to be a human being, such that you can gauge somebody's growth, if you like, by the nature and the direction of their sexual desire. That is a fundamental shift from, say, the way the Bible talks about sex. One of the problems I think Christians face today, is we're dealing with a world that thinks of sex as identity, using a text that sees sex as behavior. You can get from one to the other, but it's not as straightforward as it might be. Sex as identity, really Freud provides the conceptual framework for that. And think about that, that's a very radical move. It's a very radical move culturally. I was talking about 12 months ago, I think it was, to a young man at a church I was visiting. And he was telling me, he's about 13, and he was telling me, he came out, introduced himself to me, and he said, I used to be bisexual, but it wasn't working for me, so now I'm straight. And I thought, that's the kind of conversation that would have been utterly absurd just 10, 15 years ago. But I engaged the young man in conversation, and what emerged very quickly was that the young man in question had never actually had any sexual experiences. He was merely talking about his experience of sexual desire. That's a very, very interesting way of thinking about identity. Very interesting way of thinking about identity. But that has come to grip the popular imagination. Now, not many have read Freud, but many have watched soap operas and sitcoms that essentially promote that basic message. The narratives of pop culture by which we are surrounded essentially promote that message. And that, of course, leads to the dramatic political situation in which we find ourselves. If you think about laws about sexual behavior, if you're just thinking about behavior, then everybody's subject to them. If you start to think about sexual desire as identity, then laws about sexual behavior become laws about who is and is not allowed to be a legitimate person. Hence, the dramatic and angry identity politics of our day. Thirdly, pornography. Third point about sex. Pornography has dramatically shifted our understanding about sex and about our identity. A number of things here. This is the obvious one. You start thinking about pornography, Christians will focus on lust, feminists and Christians will focus upon objectification of those on the screen, that the people performing on the screen have been turned into means rather than ends. In other words, their significance lies simply in what they do for me, and I'm not even involved in what they are doing. But I want to suggest it's more deadly even than that. I think it also dehumanizes the one watching. The watching of pornography not only dehumanizes those on the screen, it also dehumanizes the one watching. How and why does it do that? Well, numerous ways, but one might say one thing is it isolates the sexual act from a relational narrative. What does it mean traditionally to be married? That that man and that woman have exclusive sexual relations with each other. The sex only makes sense within the context of a much larger narrative. And the sex works to reinforce that relationship, to strengthen it, to emphasize its uniqueness compared to every other relationship that the man or the woman may have. Once sex ceases to fulfill that function, the notion of humanity is changing. I'm reading this very disturbing and depressing book on transhumanism that I'm going to come to, actually transhumanism in a few minutes' time. Because of the area in which I work, the first chapter I read was the chapter on sex. It was slightly weird, actually. I was reading it on the plane, and then suddenly I realized what I was reading, and I'm thinking, man, I wonder what the guy sitting next to me thinks about, maybe he'll be asking to move, halfway through the flight or something. Think about this as a distressing but twisted scenario. Think about child pornography that is purely animated. Or think about sex dolls that are made to look like children. What do you think about those? Nobody's being hurt by them. Consent is not an issue. What do you do with that? On what grounds would you say that is wrong? I would want to make the grounds that, well, it is actually dehumanizing for somebody to watch that stuff or somebody to use that device. When we reached a point where, and this post-humanist, transhumanist advocate thinks that in 40 years' time, most men, a small majority of men, will probably be comfortable with robots rather than real women because they'll be that lifelike by that point. The difference, physical difference, will be marginal, and the amount of effort needed to obtain sexual favors will be so minimal that real women simply won't be able to compete. What do you think about that kind of world? I think that's a world where the whole notion of what it means to be a human being has been utterly transformed. The dehumanizing nature of pornography, I think, is something we need to think about. And I would say pornography also turns the desire for a particular person into a mere desire for genital satisfaction. What is it about erotic love that makes it so powerful? I think one of the things is it's not just love for anybody in general, it's love for that person in particular. Usually I teach at a Christian liberal arts school, so the typical tradition is I teach a final year class. They're all getting engaged and they're all going to get married within days of graduation. That's sort of typically how it goes. There's always an engaged couple in class. They're kind of fresh meat for me to pick on. I usually say at the beginning of the class, anybody here engaged? And they all put up their hands thinking I'm going to congratulate them. And actually, I'm just making a note so I can use them as illustrations in my later lectures. And one of the things I'll typically ask the guy or the girl at some point is, okay, you're going to get married in June. You're in that point in the ceremony where all the bridesmaids have come in. And Americans have vast numbers of bridesmaids. I think I had 3 at my wedding, maybe 4. I officiated a wedding recently where there were 11 bridesmaids and 11 groomsmen. That's like a football team, a soccer team on either side. It's huge. But anyway, after an hour and a half, all of the bridesmaids have finally made their way in, and we found room for them up the front. And the music changes, and the groom cannot resist at that point, turning around to see, because he wants to see what this woman, who is the desire of his heart, looks like on this great day. I used to preach a lot, and I made the worst mistake I ever made preaching, by the way, was when I made a comment from the pulpit, said, your wife is never more beautiful than on her wedding day. Bad thing to say. What I actually meant to say was your wife is really beautiful on your wedding day, and she gets even more beautiful after that. But I did as a sort of desperate follow-up, which was the worst recovery in history, was I said, it's all downhill from then on. I remember I had 10 women lining up to have a piece of me at the end of that. And one of them, I remember, she didn't even say, she looked at me and a little tear just trickled down her cheek. And she said, you just made me so sad, and turned around and walked away. So anyway, he turns around, and he looks down to see the woman who's coming in at the end of the aisle, and he's wanting to marry Julia, but it isn't Julia. It's Deborah. Deborah's beautiful. She's as beautiful as Julia. She's probably as fertile as Julia. Everything that he was going to do with Julia, he can do with Deborah. The question is, does he go through with the wedding? And the answer, of course, is no, particularly if his fiancée is sitting right next to him in class. He's very quick on no. And the reason, of course, is he doesn't desire every woman in general. He desires that woman in particular. His sexual desire, properly ordered, is ultimately focused on that woman, not just any woman. To use the language of the English philosopher Roger Scruton, he doesn't want to marry a body. He wants to marry the face, the particular woman. Pornography teaches us that sexual desire is about our satisfaction using anybody in general, not that other person's satisfaction in particular. And that leads me to transhumanism. Transhumanism. Transhumanism is a term used for a variety of different viewpoints that all, I think, coalesce around this: the transcendence of biological limitations. I think we already see it in some ways with the advent of in vitro fertilization. I don't wish to criticize IVF here or cast aspersions on anybody who's used it, but think about what IVF does. It's interesting, isn't it? Babies shift from being begotten to being sort of made at that point. We take a control that we traditionally don't have. Think about the cyborg feminism that's emerged in the 70s with Shulamith Firestone, Donna Haraway in the 80s, and Sophie Lewis today, focused often on reproduction. 1970, Shulamith Firestone is saying there'll come a time when men and women will both be able to give birth, and we won't require natural sexual relations to do it. She was saying that in 1970. She's a genius. That's years before IVF became even possible. Now we have Sophie Lewis arguing that we need to get rid of natural impregnation and natural childbirth altogether. Every child should be born via surrogacy because that levels the playing field. Think of the issue of gender. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto make the, in some ways in retrospect, obvious point that as industrial technology develops, so the difference between men and women will decrease. Makes sense. If you're living in the Middle Ages and you're working in an iron forge, you have to be pretty physically big and strong to do it. On average, men are going to be better qualified than women. Once you reach a point in a factory where somebody merely has to pull a lever to drive a hammer down, you only need somebody strong enough to pull a lever. That's what they're thinking about. Of course, we now live in a world where technology allows us to think about the dissolution of biological difference in far more radical ways. We now have transition surgery. We have hormones. Technology is bringing us, at least in our imaginations, very, very close to that moment where the what we are can be completely annihilated in face of the technologically enabled who we are. And notice, both in transhumanism and in attitudes to sex, particularly on the life issue, how natural bodily functions come to be regarded as problematic. The fact that a woman can conceive is regarded as a problem that must be overcome in some way. All of these things, music, medicine, sex, and transhumanism, all of them feed an imagination that makes us think that we are sovereign over who we are and make us less and less concerned with the what we are. They empower the individual will in ways that detach the who question from the what question. That raises then the question of how do we respond to this? How do we respond to this? Just a couple of things. No easy answer. There's no silver bullet. If you come tonight expecting me to have some magical solution that we just go out and apply, no, the situation is too complicated for that. But there are some things that we can at least start to think about that may allow us ultimately to push back in some way. I think they all boil down to this. We need to recapture a sense of the what we are as grounding the who we are. That's easy to say, but hard to do. One way to do this, I think, is to reflect upon and reassert the importance of our bodies for who we are. The big narrative of my book is really the narrative of how we've increasingly come to regard our inner feelings as a kind of spooky substance that inhabits our bodies a bit like a spacesuit, such that our bodies can be adjusted or improved to better fulfill the desires of the spooky substance that dwells within us. I think we need to get over that. We need to start consciously reminding ourselves that we are our bodies. Intuitively, we know that on some level. I always use in class the example of a smile. When a student smiles at me, let's say the student Abigail smiles at me, I do not say Abigail's face smiles at me. I say Abigail smiles at me. I make a close connection between her face and who she is. We are our bodies. Once we start thinking of ourselves as our bodies, a second thing falls into place, and that is the myth. The myth of the modern self plunges into crisis. What is the myth of the modern self? I think it is most succinctly articulated by Rousseau. Man is born free and everywhere is in chains. Where ultimately every relationship we have, even now the relationship to our own bodies, is seen as a hindrance or a potential hindrance to who we really are. Once we start thinking of ourselves as bodies, we can't do that anymore. About a year ago, I was giving a lecture in Lancaster on Rousseau, and my son happened to be present with his newborn daughter, my granddaughter. She was just a month or two old. And because I wanted to show her off to the audience, I thought I'd get him to stand up and we'll use her as a prop for my lecture. So he stood up and I said, hold Emily up. And he held Emily up. She's tiny, you can do that with one hand. And I asked the audience, I said, is Emily born free? What does it mean to say Emily's born free? It doesn't mean anything at all. Emily's vulnerable physical body means she is not born free. She is born utterly dependent. When I was a teenager, I bred hamsters for a while. Weird thing to do, but that's what I was into. The interesting thing about hamsters is hamsters are antisocial beings. If there is such a thing as reincarnation, I'm probably a reincarnation of a hamster, I think. I like my own time and space. If you don't separate hamsters at 21 days, they kill each other. They're savage. They're not a pack animal. They're loners. They get together to mate, and the female will try to kill the male after mating if he's not careful. He has to get away pretty quick. I was tempted to make a facetious comment about no lighting up of cigarettes for hamsters. They have to flee. They have to flee the scene. 21 days and they're completely independent. Human beings, of all creatures on the face of the planet, we are stunningly dependent upon other human beings for an absolutely impractical length of time. It's incredible. It is incredible. Why? Because we're bodies. And interestingly enough, I'm now in my mid-50s, the relationship with my children is just starting to shift a little. That after years of them being dependent upon me, we maybe enjoyed a few years where they were not dependent on me and I was not dependent upon them. But now I'm starting to tip towards being dependent upon them. Certainly when it comes to technology. But as the years go by, my body will make me more dependent upon them. Once we start thinking of ourselves as bodies, we revise our anthropology. We also, I think, if we think of ourselves as bodies, can get round some of the silliness of modern ethics. I've used this as a thought experiment. Peter Singer at Princeton, one of the greatest of the pro-infanticide, pro-abortion, pro-euthanasia thinkers. Robert George, his colleague on the Princeton faculty, one of the great pro-life thinkers. Imagine the two of them walking down Witherspoon Street late at night and hearing a little baby's cry from a doorway. And the two of them running over to the doorway and finding there in a little basket a tiny little newborn baby. There will be no difference, no disagreement between the two of them on how to address that situation. Robert George will not say, it's a little baby, we need to get it help, and we need to find the mother to help her. And Peter Singer saying, no, it's not a person until it's 2 years old. It has no conception of the future. It has no conception of itself. It has no real self-consciousness. It has no more pull on our affections than a kitten in a similar situation. We should leave it to be eaten by the feral animals of Princeton late at night. That's not going to happen. Why? Because that's a baby. It's not an idea in the abstract. It's an embodied reality. And when you can get people to think about embodied realities and particularities, ethics changes. Peter Singer, when his own mother descended into dementia, he and his sister helped care for her. And there's an interview online you can find, and he's asked, well, isn't that a bit inconsistent with your view of once somebody loses their mind, they're no longer a person, you can have them euthanized for their own good? And Peter Singer's answer is, yes, but I guess it's different when it's your own mother. Well, of course it is, because your own mother is not an abstraction to you. Your own mother is not an abstraction. Think about sexual ethics. I think here we stand a good chance of pushing back against something of what's going on. Sexual assault is typically punished by societies much more severely than other forms of assault. Why? Because we intuitively know it is a more serious form of assault. Think of Harvey Weinstein. And I'm grateful to my friend Frank Beckwith, professor of law at philosophy and law at Baylor, for this illustration. Think of Harvey Weinstein. If we discovered that Harvey Weinstein had been requiring young women to allow him to stick his finger in their ear in order to give them a part in a movie, we would regard him as a weirdo creep. And maybe he'd have done 6 months in prison. But we wouldn't regard him as the monster we do. Why not? Because we intuitively know that sexual assault is something more serious than what in Britain we would call common assault. We intuitively know that. The hashtag #MeToo movement, I think, brought many good things into the realm of public discussion. It struck me as ironic, though, that it was being pioneered by people whose cultural products teach us that sex is cost-free recreation. They know that isn't true. They know that isn't true, even though they press that message. And finally, some of them had the courage to stand up and break with the crowd and say, no. Sex is not just recreation. We all know this. I put it this way to students. Somebody slaps you or punches you, they hurt you, but you'll get over it. It may even become a story that you tell with a bit of a laugh after dinner, 6, 12, 18 months down the line. Somebody sexually assaults you, you never joke about it. Why don't you ever joke about it? Well, you never joke about it because this, I would say, our sex bodies are a deep part of us. And what is sex? Sex is something that only you can give. It is not something that can be taken. And when somebody takes it, they take that which only you can give. And what is it that they take? I would say this. It is your very self. It is your very self that they are taking by force. And only you can give yourself to another. The attitude, the view we have of sex today simply fails to take the seriousness of sex into account. So we need a sexual ethic, I think. I was talking with somebody earlier about this. We need a sexual ethic that does a whole lot better than do's and don'ts. We need a sexual ethic that is grounded in what it means to be an embodied human person. The temptation of Mephistopheles is a strong one, particularly in an era where so much money, so much brain power, and so many good things have been delivered by technology. I don't want to stand up here as a Luddite and say all technology is bad. No, technology is often very, very good. I would not want to live in the 15th century. It would have been nasty and painful to live in the 15th century. Technology has delivered many great benefits, but it also brings a temptation. And the temptation is to detach the who we are from the what we are, to empower us to make us think that we are gods. The temptation of Mephistopheles is strong, but I think ultimately it involves not just selling our souls, as Faust did to Mephistopheles, but selling our very selves as well. Thank you for listening so patiently.
Well, we did a podcast earlier today for our Lewis House podcast, and as I, was talking with Dr. Trueman there, we just said, let's just dive in, see what issues we cover, because this is such a vast and wide topic. The topics that touch on this are so far-reaching and cover so many different areas that it's so difficult to begin to even cover this in one setting. I mean, you really can't cover it in one setting, even one book, though your book covers a lot of great ground. So I realize questions may come from a lot of different directions, both across the room and maybe different topics. And so something that's maybe sparked a thought that you thought, hey, you said something here, or I read the book, or I read something online. So we just want to invite you to ask questions tonight. We've got some people, I think a couple of our Lewis House scholars, Brooklyn and Hunter, are you all around? We've got some people. So if you have a question, just hold up your hand. They are back there looking, and we'll take a few minutes for questions here. We're at about a little 8:15, so we'll take 15, 20 minutes worth of questions, and then we'll wrap it up for the night. So first question, anyone have one? Brooklyn, you have a question? Then we have one back here. We'll start over here, and then we'll go to the back, and then just hold up your hand, and Brooklyn and Hunter will be watching for you.
Okay. Hi, my name is Rebecca. I work with Pro-Life Wildcats here on campus. We're a pro-life group trying to raise awareness. And engaging with pro-choice students, I often hear what you said, consent to sex isn't consent to pregnancy. How would you try and bridge that gap for people?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult because on one level you can track the difference back to two fundamentally different views of the universe. Does the universe have a moral structure and an authority to it? Does it have a shape, or is it stuff? If you think it's just stuff, then pro-life arguments simply aren't going to work logically for you. So in terms of bridging that gap, on one level, I think it's very hard to do it intellectually. And in class, when I get the kids to think about Peter Singer, I say, well, how would you respond to Peter Singer? And the answer is, well, Peter Singer's, he's onto something when he says every weapon at our disposal tracks back to, ultimately, to human beings being made in the image of God. Whether you're a believer or not, your logic sort of tracks back there as a pro-life person. So I think on the level of argument, it's very, very difficult to do that. I guess that's where I would want to move into the realm of aesthetics. It's interesting to me that sonograms made a huge difference. Once people could see that in the womb as a person, it became easier for them to imagine the thing in the womb as a person. Tragically, that doesn't apply in the very earliest stages. But I think the emotional punch is more powerful than the logical punch on that. Secondly, I guess I would want to try to, if I could get them to accept the notion that human beings are not free and independent, but we are all dependent or obliged, then to get them to think about what is the obligation of the mother towards that which is in her womb. But I think other than a fundamental change of heart on the part of the person you're arguing with, it's very hard. It's very hard to break through. Maybe narratives as well. People have had abortions and people have chosen not to have abortions. But I think in terms of arguments, we're operating. Alistair McIntyre essentially says these days moral discourse takes place from people with mutually exclusive premises, and I think the abortion argument is a first-rate example of that. Oh, there's one at the back, yeah.
My wife doesn't want me to stand up, but I'm going to do it anyway. What a terrific lecture. Thank you. I'm going to try to form this question because I heard someone pose this, and this goes back to the child you said wasn't sure of his sexuality, transgender, cis, whatever they're talking about. But she posed it as, and going back to technology, as a social contagion. So looking back at other things that peaked, that were out of proportion medically, like bulimia, anorexia. And kids are, it goes up like an exponential curve, and we're seeing the same thing with this, like it's a fad. So maybe you could just comment on that, thinking of it as the social networking and stuff and driving that train.
Well, first of all, I think I'd want to start by saying I don't think that all people struggling with what we call gender dysphoria are necessarily struggling with it for the same reason. I think there's a difference between a 12-year-old girl and a 25-year-old man struggling with this issue. That's not to say the 25-year-old man really is a woman trapped in a man's body, but it's saying there may be very different causes for what's going on there. In terms of the craze among young women, I am very comfortable in saying it's social contagion. And I'm also very comfortable in drawing parallels with bulimia and anorexia. I think if we lift the gender dysphoria question out of the sexual identity question and set it down in the context of body dysmorphia, a lot of things become clear at that point. The difference is, and you say, will it peak? The difference is this. With anorexia and bulimia, the medical establishment, the government, and the broader culture knew it was a bad thing. It's a bad thing to encourage emaciated young girls and some young men to continue to starve themselves. We have to address the issue. We have to address the underlying psychiatric issues there. The difference today is that the entire establishment has decided, on the basis of almost zero reading of the literature, but deep listening to radical political pressure groups, that gender dysphoria is a problem of the body, not of the mind, and is therefore committing huge resources to promoting and encouraging it, for want of a better word. And that's what makes me worried about this. In retrospect, anorexia and bulimia were dealt with because everybody knew it was wrong and they acted. This is different. I was chatting to a pediatrician about 18 months ago, and I asked him bluntly, is gender dysphoria the one pathology you have to deal with where your patient has the right of self-diagnosis? And he said yes. And that shocked me, though it did not surprise me, if that makes sense. And I think one of the problems we face today is we have a catastrophic problem that is adversely affecting young girls. And the people who want to try to help these young girls are being demonized and driven out of the conversation. And I think it's wicked. I was when I spoke last week, and there were some trans people in the audience, and I got a question that I assumed came from a trans person. And I made the comment to them, I said, if you're 25 and you're a man and you want to try to be a woman and you decide to transition, if your insurance company will pay for it, I'm not going to stop you. You're an adult. Adults are allowed to make terrible, catastrophic mistakes. If you're telling me that it's a 12-year-old, we don't allow 12-year-olds to have tattoos legally. So why do we allow them to have surgeries and treatments that can ruin their lives 20 years hence? A tattoo may be unsightly. The removal of a penis or ovaries, that's done at that point. And that's where I worry. Yeah, I think this craze will peak, but I fear it's going to be supercharged before it does because of the combination, I think, of evil and stupid people who are driving this issue. And, good for J.K. Rowling. I'm glad. I don't agree with J.K. Rowling on a lot of stuff, but I'm glad that somebody who's wealthy enough and powerful enough to speak out and it not cost them their livelihood is doing it. We need those voices. If you're a teacher in a public school system, you can't speak up on this. You'll lose everything. We need the powerful people to speak up on this. And we need, those of you who are Christians, we need to pray for people like J.K. Rowling that they remain courageous and strong.
Hi. Over here. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I fear you may have just answered this, so I'll reframe it to be more on the individual level. But many harmful ideas have been scientifically based or so claimed to be, such as communism, the Third Reich, and then now gender ideology. How do we push back on the idea that these are based in science on a more individual level instead of looking at it from a broader view? What can we do on our own, in our own lives?
Sorry, I'm not sure I quite understand the question. Could you repeat it?
So there's been a lot of ideas in history that have been so claimed to be based in science,
Okay, yeah.
such as communism or the
Yeah.
Third Reich.
Yeah,
I think gender ideology
Yeah.
is widely, at least
Yeah.
claimed to be based in science.
Yeah.
And you've addressed on a wider scale what is happening slight pushbacks, people like J.K. Rowling who are pushing
Yeah.
back with larger voices. What can we do with our many smaller voices,
Right.
do you think?
I think we all need to know, we can always have the most influence in our immediate circles. So if you know people are struggling with this, then you can engage with them one by one, one-on-one, and every one of those engagements will be different and unique. When I taught at seminary, students would sometimes say to me, what do you do in this pastoral situation? Well, the first part of my answer would always be, well, every pastoral situation is unique. So the first thing I need to do is establish exactly what's going on in order to be able to respond. And that's why I would say there's a big difference between a 12-year-old girl who's a bit of a tomboy, who suddenly finds TikTokers telling her she's actually a boy trapped in a girl's body. There's a big difference between her and the 25-year-old guy who's torn apart because he really thinks he's a woman trapped in a man's body. I would respond differently to those two, depending on their background. I do think we have some unusual tools at our disposal at this point. Oddly enough, much of what went on to establish things like queer theory, the sort of suspicion of stable categories, etc., which was our enemy 10, 15 years ago, can now be our friend, I think, in some ways. The idea that, well, science is not disinterested. Science often serves larger purposes. Science often helps certain people remain powerful and keeps other people on the margins. I think some of those arguments are worth us revisiting at this point. I mean, that was the thing I think that a lot of people have never got about Nietzsche, is that Nietzsche's neither of the right or the left. Nietzsche's opposed to anybody who thinks they've got hold of the stable categories, I think. And I think that we can use some of that to disturb those who've got hold of things that they think are stable and solid. But on the individual level, I think, we should focus on the people we can individually influence, but that influence may take a different shape or form every single time.
I've got one right here. I'm over here, right in front of you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I was just thinking about, for those in the room who maybe have friends who have walked away from the faith because of being gay, or maybe are thinking about it, how do we pastorally approach our friends who are going through that?
Yeah.
Who might not come to a lecture like this and hear the well-formed argument for why they shouldn't walk in that direction, but from a pastoral standpoint, I was hoping if you could give some advice.
Sure. Again, everyone will look different because dynamics of friendships and dynamics of walking away are different. I think, first of all, pray for your friends. That's very important. And secondly, I think you need to demonstrate by your actions that what you say with your words are true. And if you say to somebody, I don't think of you as gay, I think of you as a human being made in God's image, and that's how I'm going to treat you, then I think you need to treat them that way. So I would suggest keeping in contact with your friends, being a good friend for them. Maybe they'll come around, maybe they won't. But if they don't come around, at least you can sleep at night and say, well, it was nothing I did that drove them away. I mean, I've often thought, sooner or later, I'm guessing that I'm going to teach a student, who's going to be gay, and maybe I'm going to be invited to his or her wedding. What am I going to do? Well, I'm not going to go. I can't go because of that statement, if anyone here knows any reason why these two should not be married. If nothing else, I'd have to walk out at that point. But they get married, they go away, they come back from their honeymoon. I could see, I would invite them around for dinner. What goes on in the privacy of their bedroom in some ways is between themselves and God. On that level, I would still wish to be a friend to them. I would still wish to be in contact with them. Maybe they would repudiate me. I'm thinking of one gay student in particular for whom I'm pretty sure that, we get on well, but I'm pretty sure that it is a burden to him, as it is to me, that I cannot give him the one thing that he wants, and that's affirmation. And I have to say, it's I get some comfort from the fact it's a burden to me because it means I still think of him as a human being and not as an object. It shouldn't be easy not to give our friends what they want. Otherwise, they're not really our friends. But we should still do the right thing. So I would say, pray for people and be a good friend to them. They might cut you off, but that's their choice at that point. You have not made that choice. They have made the choice.
Hi. So I love the lecture tonight. Thank you so much. I think that what you really stressed about the fact that as humans we are embodied, and that is really useful at combating a lot of the kind of nonsense ideas that we hear about a lot today. But for those of us who are Christians, most of us probably also believe that we do have a soul, that there is part of us that's not embodied.
Yeah.
And how much do you think the kind of, silly notions about our non-embodied self out there are kind of a misguided attempt at mimicking that kind of religious Christian idea that there is a part of us that's not embodied?
It was interesting. When I was at Princeton, I gave a paper on my work, and a friend of mine, a guy called Anton Barber Kay, who's a Catholic philosopher, was there. And he raised this point. He said, but don't you think that a distinction between the body and the soul really opens the way for this? And he was being a bit of the devil's advocate. He was wanting to test me. And I certainly think that's true. And I would say a lot of Christians fall into the error of thinking that we're soul, that really we are soul and the body's an appendage. But of course, the doctrine of the resurrection militates against that, because if we're just soul, then presumably Jesus' death on the cross would be enough. We wouldn't need him to rise from the dead, and we wouldn't need a final resurrection. I love the stuff that Thomas Aquinas, the medieval Catholic scholastic theologian, says about what happens when you die. He says something to the effect of, when you die, your soul goes to be with the Lord, but it isn't you until the day of resurrection. It's like part of you. You are body and soul. So I think that as Christians, and I think Protestants perhaps are particularly prone to this, though I don't think the problem is uniquely Protestant. We need to recapture, or we need to teach positively on what it means to be a body. Not that I want to move into a sort of monistic direction where we don't have a soul. No, I do believe that we are a soul and a body. I do believe that when I die, my soul will go somewhere and my body will join it later. But we need to be taught what the body means. And I think that would, when I was taught sort of sexual ethics to the extent I was in a church, it was all do's and don'ts. It was not grounded in this is what the body is, and this is what the body is for. I was recently on a podcast with Andrew Sullivan, the gay journalist, and we were going back and forth on gay marriage, and at some point I made the point to him, and he sort of conceded it. Look, Andrew, look at the human bodies. My body is not meant to be inserted into yours in certain ways. I don't want to be too crude. It's just not. And when we do that, we end up with problems. And Andrew, I think, is a HIV-positive person, so he's acutely aware of the problems that this would generate. Lovely fellow, but I like Andrew, by the way, a lot. But it struck me that he felt the pinch of that argument. And I think one of the things we need to do as Christians is teach our young people and our old people what bodies are for, what their theological significance is.
Hi. Sorry.
Okay, the trouble is everything comes from the one speaker, so I have no idea who anybody is. Yes, I see you now.
Hi. Yes, thanks so much for being here this evening. If you don't mind if I take just a slight widening of your talk about identity, in terms of bringing the critique of self as determined by psychological constructions and whatnot, do you think you could bring the same critique from faith to the category of self defined by property, in terms of that being something that's been woven through our history as well? And it seems to be similarly very problematic from the idea of an orthodox Christian anthropology. So how could you widen the discussion we're having now towards things that are concomitantly kind of in our culture, but are not always given the same sort of dialogue that we have?
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this when you talked about Shulamith Firestone and her idea of sort of ex utero gestation, but that, the first time we heard about that really was in Brave New World, which was 40 years before. So anyway, that's what I was asking.
So you're thinking about the other ways we identify ourselves, things we own, that sort of stuff? Is that the
Well, I was
question?
have not gotten your book yet, but this idea of the idea of self as defined by property or self as defined by body, and you sort of use those as the opposite to the self defined by philosophical constructions. And so I was saying that from a Orthodox Christian anthropology, it seems like self-defined by property would be equally problematic. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
What do you mean by property? Are you thinking the properties of being a person or property
No, I'm
that
sorry.
we own?
It's an excerpt from your book that I read, and just this idea of that as throughout history and as the country started, that you had said that in place of self-defined by property and self-defined by body.
I was talking, I think I'm talking about Jefferson there.
Yes, you are talking about
And
Jefferson,
the-
exactly.
The famous statement of Jefferson where he makes the comment that it's in his, I think it's his notes on the state of Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And he makes the comment about, he's talking in the context of religious freedom, what does it matter if my neighbor believes in one God or 10 gods or no God at all?
Until he steals something from me or
wonderful
kicks
phrase,
me.
It neither picks my pocket nor breaks
Breaks
my
my
leg.
leg, yeah. Mhm.
And the point I'm trying to make in the book there is, for Jefferson, his sense of self and his sense of worth was really tied up with what he owned and his physical health. That if you're not beating him up and you're not taking his property from him, you're not harming him. Whereas we live in a world where we identify ourselves with our beliefs and our feelings, so that if somebody contradicts those beliefs or inhibits or hurts our feelings, then we do feel damaged. And the hurt and the pain and the damage caused is very real. May not seem real to Jefferson, but he doesn't live in our world. He lives in this world where what he owns and the integrity of his body are key to freedom, key to him being able to be himself. Is that problematic too? I would say, yes, that would generate its own problems. It's not the problem we face at the moment. I think because Jefferson's world is not our world. I don't think that people so much define themselves, on the whole, primarily by what they own. Certainly we do to some extent. But I think what we've seen in recent years is, or if I could put it this way, okay, maybe we do define ourselves by what we own in our bodies, but we have raised psychological categories to the same level. And you see this in the notion of victimhood. Victimhood is a status symbol now. But you don't have to have lost property or been physically confined to be a victim. Emotional damage will do it for you.
Sure. I guess what I'm saying is I'm trying to see how that's less legitimate than I think what I'm saying is the underlying valuation of self with property, whether it's self-designation or designation from outside, it just seems like as a Christian we could bring a similar critique to that, which I don't seem to hear as much in terms of like human resources.
Yeah, I certainly think that if a Christian defines themselves by that which they own or by greed or something like that, that's highly problematic.
I think I was thinking of culture and society defining us that way, like human resources, the idea of your value in terms of work, whatnot. I'm just saying I think there might be room for a similar critique spread out in other areas of,
and I mean,
of society and culture.
That's very similar to Marx's critique. The idea that human beings become, in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution changes us to entries in a balance sheet. We become the wage that we can earn rather than the things that we produce. So problematic, I think.
Hello. I am a pastor and really appreciate the book on several levels. When I say the book, Strange New World, you have a couple of books. One of the things that really caught my attention from reading it was getting through the first 8 chapters. And at the beginning of the 9th chapter, you addressed my problem. For traditional Christians, the narrative of this book is inevitably a somewhat depressing one. Absolutely. And that was difficult indeed, but yet at the same time, as a pastor, a lot of things I've dealt with, it addressed and went those directions. The same chapter, and this is not so much a question, it's more of a statement, so you're safe. Just a few pages over, I was excited to read the statement, reaffirmation of the faith, but God is sovereign. God plays the long game, and God's will shall be done on earth as it is in heaven. Thank you for a lot of time and energy, and I suspect years that you have put into this.
Oh, thank you very much. It's very kind of you to say that.
is an important one. Dark side of the moon or the wall?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Dark side of the moon.
Oh, dark side of the moon. Yes, sorry. Yeah. Dark side of the moon. Dark side of the moon. Yeah. The wall is just a bit too depressing, and the school scenes reminded me too much of a particular headmaster. So it's,
Okay, sweet. I'm right over here. So I loved this speech. I loved this. It was very, very helpful. I did have just sort of one thought or question. When you were talking towards the beginning about the boy who had like bisexual desires, and you were making a big point of how the Bible sees this as behavior, sex as behavior. And we live in a culture that connects it to our identity, which I very much agree with the Bible. And then later on, you were talking about sex as something so sacred, and it's something that only like oneself, it's the giving of oneself, and then only they can give that. How would you communicate the distinction between sex being something so sacred and not casual, while also not at all bleeding into our identity?
yeah, good question. I'm not sure that I would want to go as far as say it shouldn't be a bleed into at all into our identity. I mean, I think we are creatures with sex bodies, and sexual desire is very powerful. I made the point earlier in one discussion that the reason why we can understand the Iliad today is because the dynamics of the Iliad, the excesses of erotic love and the damage it can do to human relationships, that's something we're all very familiar with in the world in which we live. What I wouldn't want to do, though, is I would want to try to set the context of sexual desire and sexual activity in a more relational setting. Where does it come from? It comes from Adam and Eve. Adam is alone. He's given Eve. I think Milton captures this beautifully, actually, in Paradise Lost. I get the students to look at some of the passages in Paradise Lost relating to Adam's erotic desire for Eve. I would want to say we need to it's not sex as identity, but sex as recreation that's the real problem here. That once we understand the proper function of sex, then the function of sex in our identity becomes clearer. So we need to, first of all, put to death sex as recreation, and then build on sex as the seal of the marital bond, as that which then proceeds to informing our identity. Is sex part of my identity? Yes, precisely because it binds me to my wife. And my relationship to my wife is a fundamental part of who I am now. So that's where I'd want to go. And that's why I say at the end, we need to think far more deeply about how we, as a church, think and teach sexual ethics. We've tended to do it as a do or don't thing, which is, there are do's and don'ts there, don't get me wrong. But those do's and why? That's the question I get from my students. Why is it wrong? So I could have a student come to my office and say, why is homosexuality wrong? Show me in the Bible. Well, I could show them 4 or 5 biblical texts. At the back of their mind, the question of, but why? Is it just because God is mean and wants my gay friends to have miserable, lonely lives? I have to do better than just point them to Bible texts. I have to show them how those Bible texts illuminate a much broader reality. And so I think that's where we need to go. Yep, sex is part of my identity, but not as a self-standing desire, as it integrates into a much broader sense of what it means to be a human being. The reason why society traditionally puts such constraints on sex is it is such a powerful thing. It is such a powerful thing.
Dr. Trueman, hello. I read that Hitler said once, "Give me the youth, and I'm satisfied." And going even earlier, communism itself took the children and indoctrinated them. I know because I'm from Romania and I lived under communism. So it seems that communism and all the other isms is out there understood the power that the state education has over little children.
Yeah.
And as Christian parents, we have seen, and we're discovering now more than ever before perhaps, how the LGBTQ plus lobbying has been successful over the years by writing little books that we kind of perhaps overlooked, getting into schools. So looking forward for Christian parents, what are your thoughts on how we as Christian parents can better equip our children in the academic circles for those who cannot afford perhaps private schooling, Christian academies, or homeschooling, but engaged in the public arena of academia? How can we better equip them to think critically and basically try to find the meat and chew out the bone?
Yeah, good question. I think first of all, don't give them smartphones. Seriously, don't give them smartphones. If a child has a smartphone, it doesn't matter whether you homeschool them or send them to a private Christian school or whatever. You've allowed some of the most evil people in the universe direct access to your child. And your child will find them more plausible than any authorities you care to put into their lives. So, no smartphone. A strong church. Nothing beats teaching children that church is a serious thing and making sure that you're in a church where they're well taught. I think that is very important too. I think modeling in your own lives what it means to be a proper parent. I think being in the public arena, there are some things I think that we need to watch for. One of the most disturbing developments in the US at the moment is, I think, a tilt towards a functional definition of parenting in the culture. Even used there, I use parenting as a verb. It's very interesting to me that parent, when I was growing up, parent was just a noun. Now it's a verb. And we are seeing shifts, I think, in attitude which will, if they're not being already reflected in certain states' laws, will be reflected in states' laws of seeing parenting as a functional activity. Once parenthood is defined functionally, then those who define the function define who the parent of your child is. So I think we need to be very hawkish about what our legislators are doing relative to laws about what it means to be a parent. Because functional, there are really bad parents out there. And just because you're a parent doesn't mean you're a good parent. But the vast majority of parents are good parents. And as soon as you shift to a functional, legal definition of being a parent, there's going to be very serious consequences. So that's what to watch for. But I think strong church, no smartphone, good role models. Those are key things.
So I actually have 3 questions, but 2 of them are very short. So
the answer's very short, though. That's the key.
Yeah, that is the question. So the whole lecture is about identity and the self and things of that nature. But there didn't seem to be a definition of the self that was used or introduced. So I would ask you to give me a definition that you're using for this lecture.
Yeah. I think I'm talking here about our consciousness of ourselves relative to the world around us. Not in terms of I know I'm me and I'm not you, but in terms of how do I imagine myself to be within this world? What is my vision of what it means to live the good life? What is my vision of what it means to be fulfilled? How do I understand my relationships with others? So, for example, if we take my embodied notion at the end, what is the self if we take the body seriously? The self is a rational, dependent thing. I think of myself as rational, I can think, and I understand myself as dependent, not as independent. If I take Rousseau's view that I'm free but everywhere put into chains, I think of myself as rational, but I think as all my other relationships as contractual. And as those that can be dissolved as soon as they do not meet the fulfillment of my own particular desires or my own happiness. So it's self, when I'm using it in the more technical sense, is that sense of what it means to be me in relation to the world around me.
I see. So what would you define like a good identity as? Like, how would you, with interacting with other people and seeing yourself within like a greater collective almost, how would one cultivate a good identity?
Yeah, well, if I was talking to another Christian, I'd want to go to man made in the image of God. And I would want to reflect upon what that means. If I was talking to somebody who's not a Christian, I think I would go for the dependency obligation angle and say, okay, here's your view of the self. You think of yourself as free, a free will, free floating. What does that mean for the relationships you have with others? Is that fully satisfactory? Think about yourself when you were born. Were you free then? So I would want to operate on the basis of, well, what does my body actually mean I am as opposed to what I wish I am? Well, it means I'm dependent in some way.
I see. And my last question, it's a bit different than the last two. You touched on transhumanism a little bit about halfway through the lecture.
Yeah.
And I'm a big fan of Nietzsche, and I've read some of his stuff. And he does make the point that, he claims that man is something to be overcome.
Yeah.
I think if Nietzsche were alive and well today and he saw who was saying the same thing that he was, at least in regards to that, he would be thoroughly disgusted by them. So I suppose I would like to ask, what is the difference? What happened in between the two, I suppose?
Yeah, I think Nietzsche would be... You may know more about Nietzsche than I do. I think Nietzsche would be disgusted by the fact that I think Nietzsche would possibly see transhumanism as tilting in a nihilistic direction, that it's all about taking the pain and suffering out of life. And the way I read Nietzsche is that Nietzsche sees pain and suffering as something to be confronted and triumphed over, and it's that makes me great. It's the eternal return. I think you may be right. What was the question you were asking?
So I just wanted to, ask, how did Nietzsche's transhumanism turn into that transhumanism, I suppose?
Yeah, I think
Or is there any correlation at all, and they're just sort of using the same language?
I think there's a correlation on the grounds that they see man as something to be overcome. Mm-hmm. What they see him to be overcome by is different.
I see.
And I think the lack of pain, the comfortable life, the lack of struggle, which I see in a lot of transhumanist writings, as something that Nietzsche would not approve of.
I see.
How we get there, I guess the therapeutic culture. It's a therapeutic thing. And I'm not sure that Nietzsche would be on board with a therapeutic culture. I think he would regard it as soft in many ways. So, it's an interesting comment. My friend Shiloh Brooks at Princeton, I think, would agree with you. He's a Nietzsche scholar, and I think he would agree.
Thank you for your answers.
Okay.
Dr.
Are we going to do one more? We got one last question. Okay, one final question. You get the final question.
Thank
there
you.
Go. Yeah.
As a historian, I have a couple historical questions for you. One more general and one more particular. As a Christian who practices history, who is in the historical discipline, what do you see as the role of the historical disciplines in combating these ideologies? That's the more general question. More particular question, as there's a lot of ressourcement going on right now, a lot of renewed interest in church history and in the past, especially among Protestants, what do you see the role of, for example, like the early church and their dealing with Gnosticism and maybe the parallels to the transhumanism today? Where could we learn from them?
As the first, I think the helpful thing about church history, I think it injects modesty into human ambition. That I'm reading this book on transhumanism yesterday and today, and it's immensely depressing. But part of me is thinking, well, I've read this sort of stuff before. The eugenics stuff of the early 20th century had a horribly similar ring. Now we have more technological capabilities now. But as a historian, I'm acutely aware that every utopian vision has tended to end in utter disaster. Now, that's not necessarily to say that every utopian vision must end that way. We can only say that everyone so far has failed. But I think it gives me, if I'm a betting man, I'm going to put my money on it not delivering utopia. And what strikes me, for example, about the discussion of sex dolls that this woman has, is, men can, they don't have to work hard to have real partners anymore. I'm thinking, well, is that a great scenario, a disastrous one? Does that mean we're going to have lots and lots of very lonely old people around? Because Technology may be able to deliver the most fantastic sex I've ever had in my entire life. But if the purpose of sex is not about delivering the greatest number of fantastic orgasms, but actually serve some other purpose, is that other purpose not lost and destroyed by this? So I think history can be helpful in not necessarily saying, well, I've seen it all before, just ignore it. It's same old, but it can at least inject a certain modesty into what we're doing. Second question was about, can we learn from the early church? There's a lot of people draw parallels between what's going on today and Gnosticism. And there is, on a superficial level, there's a downplaying of the material. Although it's a little bit more complicated than that, on the grounds that I think, for example, transgenderism is not really Gnostic, because the body's still important. If it was merely Gnostic, then there would be no need for hormone therapy and transition surgery, because the real you really is entirely separable from the body. There is this strange ambiguity at the heart, particularly of the transgender issue, where my body is of no importance to my identity and my body is of critical importance to my identity, which I think separates it from early church Gnosticism. Where I think the early church is helpful is, the early Christians were regarded as seditious and immoral, and they were marginalized in society. And I think that's kind of where we're probably going to end up. If you invite too many people like me to speak, that's where you'll end up, on the marginal, seditious end of society. What I think is encouraging then is to know that the early church became strong, partly because it was marginalized. A little bit like the Jews in medieval Europe, a little bit like the Quakers and the Baptists in 19th century England, or like the LGBTQ movement in the latter part of the 20th century. All of these groups have been marginalized, and all of them became remarkably strong and remarkably successful. So I think we should take some strategic and encouraging lessons from the early church on that front. But I'm not persuaded that what we're dealing today is precisely the same logic as they were dealing with in Gnosticism.